It was past midnight when the palace walls, long, silent witnesses to secrets, trembled with a sound no one expected, a whispered call in the darkness. Hidden away, young Prince George had pressed record, capturing Camilla's voice as it carried a confession that would shatter the family forever. What could a child possibly uncover that left the world gasping in disbelief? The air itself seemed charged, heavy with an unseen weight, as if destiny had conspired to place the future king at the exact place, at the exact moment, where history would change course. George had not meant to find himself in this position. Restless, unable to sleep, he wandered the long corridors of the palace, halls that often seemed alive with echoes of the past. On this night, however, those echoes weren't of memory, but of something happening in real time. A faint voice drifted from a nearby chamber, low, hurried, laced with something that sounded very much like fear. It was a voice he knew. Camilla. The queen consorted herself, speaking not with calm authority, but with a tone he had never heard before, sharpened by urgency, cracking under the pressure of secrets too heavy to contain. For a boy his age, curiosity often won over caution. Yet in this moment, it wasn't mere curiosity. It was instinct. George pulled out the small device, almost a toy in his hands, and pressed record. He knew the rules, the invisible codes of silence that governed palace life, but something deep inside told him this was not a moment to ignore. It was a forbidden act, one that broke the unspoken laws of protocol, yet it felt necessary, as if his very future depended on preserving those words. Why was Camilla speaking at this hour, with her voice barely above a whisper? Midnight was not a time for routine conversation. Midnight was for secrets. And this, George realized, was a secret the world was never meant to hear. The eerie timing carved itself into his memory. He would never forget the sound of the clock, striking 12 as her voice quivered, desperate, as though the walls themselves might betray her. His heart pounded as he strained to capture every syllable. He didn't understand everything she said, but he understood enough. There were words about documents, about removing obstacles, and about silence, always about silence. Even at his age, George knew that such words were dangerous. They didn't belong in a palace meant to symbolize stability and trust. They belonged in the shadows, where schemes festered. What struck him most was not just the content of her words, but the weight behind them. There was a sharpness, a desperation, as though Camilla was clutching at power slipping through her hands. And yet, beneath the desperation, there was fear. Not the fear of being caught, but the fear of consequences too great to face. It was as if she carried knowledge that daylight itself would never dare reveal. The boy sat frozen, torn between dread and determination. He could not grasp the full meaning of what he was hearing, but he knew instinctively that it was monumental. History whispered through that call, wrapping itself around his small shoulders, pressing him into a role no child should bear. Still, he did not stop recording. Perhaps it was the faint echo of his grandmother Diana's spirit, urging him to guard the truth when others might conceal it. Perhaps it was simply fate. Whatever it was, George's choice would alter everything. The palace slumbered on, unaware that its very foundations were being shaken in silence. The corridors remained dark, the night guards oblivious, the world outside still at rest. Yet within those ancient walls, a secret was captured, one that would slip beyond control, one that would ignite firestorms in every corner of the globe. The recording began as nothing more than a child's instinct, but it was already becoming something much more, a weapon of truth, a ticking clock, a shadow waiting to swallow the monarchy. But what exactly did Camilla say in that trembling midnight call that forced George into the role of reluctant witness? Imagine the queen consort's voice, not in ceremony or grandeur, but shaking in the still of the night, begging, warning, confessing. Camilla's call wasn't routine. It was desperate, frantic, and laced with words that could rip apart the monarchy. And now, thanks to George's small act of defiance, the truth she tried to bury forever would soon be dragged into the light. What the young prince captured was more than a private conversation. It was the unraveling of a facade built over decades, and the first whisper of a storm that would not be contained. The tone of Camilla's voice was enough to freeze the air. Gone was the polished calm she displayed in public, replaced by a raw tremor that betrayed not just anxiety, but fear. Every word carried weight. Every pause seemed loaded with dread, as though the walls themselves might betray her secrets. For the first time, the queen consort sounded like a woman cornered, haunted by enemies both inside and outside the palace gates. Her words stumbled between urgency and desperation, and it became clear that this was no ordinary midnight call. It was a lifeline, a confession, a plea whispered into the darkness. Among the fragments George recorded, 2 words repeated with unnerving clarity: documents and removing obstacles. For a boy, the meaning was elusive. But for those who would later hear the recording, those phrases would echo like a thunderclap. What documents could possibly inspire such panic? What obstacles did she mean to remove, and at what cost? The ambiguity was more dangerous than certainty, because it allowed imagination to fill the gaps with the darkest of possibilities. In her voice was not only urgency but calculation, as if she knew time was running out and moves had to be made quickly before the truth escaped her grasp. What made the call even more chilling was the repeated plea for secrecy. Camilla urged the unknown voice on the other end to ensure silence, to guarantee that nothing slipped beyond their control. The words carried a weight that felt less like a request and more like a command born of desperation. To George, it sounded strange, frightening even. Why would someone so powerful need to beg for silence unless the truth was explosive enough to ruin everything? The image of monarchy as untouchable and unshakable crumbled with each tremble in her speech. Her tone wavered, almost breaking at moments. It was impossible to tell whether she was trembling with guilt or paralyzed by fear. Was she confessing sins already committed, or panicking over schemes yet to unfold? The line between the two blurred in her voice, leaving behind only the unmistakable scent of danger. George, young and confused, may not have grasped the full implications, but instinct told him enough. This was not a conversation meant to vanish into the night. This was something the world would one day need to hear. For him, keeping the recording wasn't just curiosity. It was determination. A flicker of resolve burned inside him, even though he barely understood why. Perhaps it was the ghost of Diana's courage echoing through his bloodline, or the innocent instinct of a child unwilling to let fear dictate silence. Whatever the reason, George held tightly to the secret, unaware that his act of quiet rebellion would soon become the catalyst for revelations far beyond his imagination. The recording wasn't just private, it was dangerous. Every syllable dripped with implications that, once exposed, could set the palace ablaze. What George had stumbled into wasn't a secret meant for whispers. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Yet Camilla never imagined the one listening wasn't just on the other end of the line, but right inside the palace walls. For a child destined to one day wear the crown, George now carried a secret that even kings would tremble to hold. At just his age, he wasn't supposed to know about betrayal, deception, or the heavy weight of monarchy's dark truths. But fate had thrust him into a role no training could prepare him for, the child who knew too much. The innocence of youth collided with the cruel machinery of power, and in that clash, George's world was altered forever. He could no longer sleep peacefully after what he had recorded. His mind replayed Camilla's trembling voice in the dark, words that echoed like a curse through his young imagination. He wanted to pretend he hadn't heard them, to believe the palace was still the fortress of tradition and family unity it was meant to be. But the memory gnawed at him. Should he keep silent, protecting himself from the storm? Or should he reveal the truth to those he trusted most, his parents? The decision hung over him like a shadow, a burden far too heavy for a boy who should have been dreaming of school, play, and simpler futures. This was the cruel irony of destiny. A child, groomed to one day inherit unimaginable power, was being tested long before his time. His grandfather, his father, the entire lineage of monarchs before him had faced trials of their own. But George's trial was different. His was not a war waged on distant battlefields or across Parliament's halls. It was a war inside his own home, one whispered through the darkness of a midnight call. He was no longer shielded from corruption. He had looked it in the face and captured it in his hands. The contrast was striking. On the outside, he was still seen as the sweet, playful child, the symbol of a promising future for the monarchy. Yet inside, he carried knowledge meant only for the hardened and the powerful. It was as if two worlds had been stitched into his young heart, the innocence of youth and the poison of adult deceit. He could not speak of it freely, yet silence felt unbearable. It was here that history itself seemed to repeat, for wasn't this the very pattern that had once consumed his grandmother, Princess Diana? She too had been silenced, her truths buried until they erupted with tragic force. And now, in George, that same legacy stirred again, like an echo across generations. The weight of this inheritance pressed harder each day. He feared what might happen if Camilla discovered the truth. The thought of her gaze falling upon him, knowing he had overheard and recorded her darkest words, chilled him to the core. He imagined retaliation, whispered warnings, and the possibility of being cast as a traitor within his own family. The palace walls, once his playground, now loomed like a prison, holding both protection and threat within the same stone. Yet within that fear, something else awoke. Resolve. George might have been a child, but he was also Diana's grandson and William's heir. That bloodline carried with it courage, resilience, and a sense of duty that could not be extinguished by fear. Quietly, without announcement or declaration, George made a vow to himself. He would protect his family, no matter what it cost him. He would not let Camilla's midnight words destroy those he loved. He held the recording not just as evidence, but as a shield, a weapon of truth for the moment it was most needed. But the recording could not remain in the shadows forever. It was destined to reach ears that would ignite a storm. When William and Catherine pressed play, silence fell. Their son's trembling hand offered them proof of something they never dared imagine. Camilla's voice, rasping, panicked, deliberate, echoed through the room, stripping away the fragile veneer of family unity. For William it was déjà vu, another betrayal threatening his mother's memory. For Catherine, it was the moment she realized the monarchy's future now rested on what they would do next. The air grew heavier with each second, the sound of Camilla's trembling words filling the space like a haunting confession. The atmosphere was chilling, almost unbearable. Catherine clutched her chest as though the voice itself had pierced her heart, her eyes brimming with tears that balanced pain and fury. Rage burned beneath her sorrow, the realization that the woman who stood beside Charles in public grandeur could harbor words so venomous in private. Every sentence, every breath Camilla took in that call, dismantled the illusion of unity the monarchy had worked tirelessly to preserve. Catherine's tears were not just of grief, they were the silent rage of a mother who knew her children were now pulled into a storm they never asked for. William sat motionless, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed carved from stone. His fury boiled beneath the surface, yet he forced himself into stillness, holding back an eruption that threatened to shatter the room. He had lived this before, as a child caught in the shadow of his mother Diana's pain, and now he saw history cruelly circling back, targeting his own son. Camilla's voice did more than wound him. It dragged his mother's ghost into the room, whispering of betrayal, secrecy, and the suffocating weight of royal deceit. For William, every word was both a knife in the present and a scar reopened from the past. The shadows of Charles and Diana's tumultuous history loomed large in that moment. The recording felt like an echo of wounds never healed, repeating the cycle of betrayal and silence that had defined his childhood. The parallels were too sharp to ignore once again. Deceit threatened to poison the family's legacy. Catherine, sensing this, reached for William's hand. But even in their unity, they felt the crushing burden of what the truth demanded. This was no longer just about them. The monarchy's survival, their children's future, even Diana's memory, all now tangled in a web spun by Camilla's midnight words. And then came the greatest fear of all. George, their son, had not just overheard. He had become the keeper of the truth. They could not ignore the danger this placed him in. Catherine trembled at the thought of what Camilla might do if she discovered who had recorded the call. The weight of maternal fear pressed against her chest, while William's protective instincts roared, demanding action, yet knowing that exposing the truth would put their child directly in the line of fire. Protecting George meant silence. Protecting the crown meant revelation. Both paths led to devastation. The choice before them was impossible. To protect their son would mean hiding evidence that could forever change the monarchy. To reveal it would mean sacrificing his innocence and placing him at the heart of a scandal too large to control. The silence stretched, each second forcing them deeper into despair, each glance between them heavy with unspoken questions. How could they save their family without destroying the throne? How could they honor Diana's truth without breaking their own son? But even before they could decide, whispers of the recording slipped beyond palace walls. One leak, just a single digital echo, was enough to shake the entire world. The recording didn't stay hidden. It slipped into hands eager to burn the monarchy's facade. By morning, what began as a child's midnight discovery had become the most explosive royal scandal of the century. And suddenly, Camilla's words, never meant for the public ear, were echoing across every headline. The palace had always lived in fear of whispers, but this was no whisper, it was a roar, and there was no silencing it. The question that tormented William and Catherine was how the recording escaped their control. Some say a trusted aide betrayed them. Others whisper it was leaked intentionally by someone inside who believed the public had the right to know. Regardless of the truth, once it surfaced, there was no pulling it back. The midnight call, as it was quickly branded, became a symbol of secrecy shattered, a moment when the walls of royal silence collapsed under the weight of raw exposure. The media frenzy erupted with unrelenting force. Every channel, every outlet, every headline screamed of Camilla's trembling voice captured in the dead of night. Commentators dissected every word, every pause, every crack in her tone. The phrases "documents" and "removing obstacles" were repeated so often they began to sound like a curse upon the monarchy. Around the globe, the recording played in endless loops, and suddenly, the carefully staged royal image of unity and composure was ripped apart in front of billions. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Staff scrambled in every direction, desperate to contain the damage. Phone lines burned with urgent calls, advisors argued over strategies, and courtiers whispered of resignations to come. Some urged denial, others pushed for silence, but all knew one thing: this was beyond their control. The scandal had grown too large, the truth too loud, the fire too wild to smother. For the first time in decades, the monarchy felt fragile, trembling under the weight of its own secrets. The public's response was equally unforgiving. Outrage swelled like a tide, drowning sympathy beneath waves of anger and betrayal. Accusations flew, claims of manipulation, of schemes designed to silence, of betrayals too deep to forgive. Ordinary citizens, once loyal to the monarchy, now questioned everything. If the queen consort could speak such words in secret, what else lay hidden? Trust, once cracked, began to crumble. For many, the monarchy no longer looked like a pillar of stability, but a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. Even beyond Britain, the impact reverberated. World leaders watched quietly, measuring the implications of the scandal. Questions arose about the monarchy's stability, about succession, about whether the cracks in the family might soon shatter the institution entirely. The recording wasn't just scandalous, it was destabilizing. It exposed the monarchy not as untouchable, but as human, flawed, and deeply divided. For allies and rivals alike, the spectacle was both shocking and strategic. And through it all, Camilla's silence screamed louder than any denial. She refused to comment, refused to clarify, refused to offer any explanation. That silence, heavy and deliberate, only fueled speculation further. Was she guilty? Was she planning her counterstrike? Or was she paralyzed, caught in the net of her own words? Every day she stayed silent, the narrative grew darker, twisting her image into one of secrecy and guilt. And as the world roared with shock, The palace itself turned into a battlefield of whispered threats and desperate defenses. Camilla was no stranger to scandal, but this time was different. The call was undeniable, her words etched in public memory. Yet she refused to crumble. Instead, she sharpened her weapons: spin, denial, and calculated rage. But behind closed doors, her fury was volcanic, aimed not just at her enemies, but at the child who dared expose her. For Camilla, this wasn't only about survival. It was about reclaiming control of a narrative that threatened to destroy her place in history. In public, she was poised, composed, the picture of dignity under fire. Facing the cameras, she dismissed the recording with a coolness that belied the storm raging inside her. She claimed her words had been twisted, misinterpreted, taken out of context by those desperate to undermine her. She painted herself as the victim of manipulation, a woman hounded by forces jealous of her position. The performance was polished, almost convincing, and for a moment, it seemed she might win back the sympathy of those who wanted to believe her. But beyond the palace gates, no one was buying it. The recording was too clear, too damning, too raw to be explained away. Still, Camilla pressed forward with her strategy of denial, leaning on her years of experience in weathering scandals. Yet when the cameras switched off, her mask slipped, revealing the fury she directed at those closest to her. George, in particular, became the invisible target of her wrath. Though she could never say it aloud, she seethed at the thought of a child undermining her authority. The idea that an heir so young could hold such power over her was unbearable. Charles, caught in the middle, was torn apart by conflicting loyalties. His wife demanded his full defense, but his son and grandson were now directly entangled in the scandal. Each word Camilla spoke pressed him deeper into a corner. Should he defend her and risk alienating his own blood, or turn against her and fracture the fragile unity of the crown? His silence, his hesitation, only deepened the perception of division. For Camilla, his wavering loyalty felt like betrayal, and in her private moments, she raged not just at her enemies, but at the man she relied on to keep her shielded. Behind the curtain, advisors and power brokers offered grim counsel. They told her plainly, fight or be erased. In their eyes, retreat would be fatal, an admission of guilt that would end her reign as queen consort. She had to go on the offensive. She had to convince the world that the call meant nothing, or, worse, that it meant something far more innocent than it sounded. But the harder she pushed, the more the cracks in her armor showed. Her aggression was not the confidence of innocence, it was the desperation of someone watching the walls close in. And then came the whispers of retaliation. If she couldn't erase the recording, perhaps she could turn the spotlight elsewhere. Camilla was too seasoned to strike openly, but the suggestion hung in the air. Leaks, counter-scandals, and subtle moves that could tarnish others and shift the conversation away from her. The palace began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a battlefield. Each step a calculation, each glance heavy with suspicion. But no spin could erase. The question now echoing everywhere. What else was she hiding? This wasn't just a scandal, it was war within the royal bloodline. William and Catherine stood defiant, defending their son, while Charles, broken, torn, struggled to hold together what was already collapsing. Anne, long the silent warrior, now stepped forward with damning reminders of the family's past. The monarchy's greatest fear was no longer public opinion. It was the implosion of its own heart. What had once been whispered behind palace doors was now spilling into the open, turning private anguish into a very public fracture. William's fury could no longer be hidden. The recording was not just a scandal to him. It was a direct insult to his mother's legacy and a fresh betrayal to his son. His words, sharp and uncompromising, cut through the fragile fabric of family civility. He made it clear that Camilla had crossed a line from which there was no return. For William, this was personal, a confrontation not only with the queen consort, but with the very history that had haunted him since childhood. His anger wasn't fleeting. It was the simmering rage of a man who saw his family's scars being reopened before the world. Catherine, though softer in her manner, was no less fierce. She wrapped herself around George like a shield, determined that no amount of pressure, no weight of tradition, would allow her son to be sacrificed on the altar of royal image. She saw the innocence of a child being crushed by the sins of adults, and she swore it would not happen again. Her voice trembled not from fear but from a mother's righteous fury, a promise that she would stand between her son and the storm, even if it meant defying the crown itself. And then there was Charles. Torn between the woman he had chosen and the family he had created, his torment was visible to all. Every glance at William reminded him of Diana, every word from Camilla demanded loyalty. He was trapped in an agony of divided loyalties, unable to choose, unwilling to confront the truth that his silence only deepened the cracks. The king who was meant to unite found himself instead presiding over the slow unraveling of everything he had inherited. His indecision was not neutral, it was destructive, leaving those around him feeling abandoned in the very moment they needed his strength most. Anne, however, did not remain silent. She had been the steady figure in the background for decades, often overlooked, often underestimated, but now she rose with words that cut sharper than any blade. History repeats when truth is buried. Her warning was not simply for Camilla, it was for all of them. She invoked the memory of the past, reminding them that secrecy had already destroyed one generation and it would destroy another if they allowed it. Her presence forced the others to confront what they feared most, that Diana's tragedy was being replayed before their eyes, only with new victims. The gulf widened with each passing day. On one side, William and Catherine, driven by fury and protection, demand accountability. On the other, Camilla, fighting to hold her ground, refusing to yield, backed by a fractured Charles who struggled to find his voice. Between them stood George, a child unknowingly holding the truth that had shaken the monarchy to its core. The rift was no longer invisible, it was tearing the family apart in full view of a world hungry for answers. The monarchy itself began to show visible cracks. Public appearances became strained, smiles forced, and the once carefully maintained image of unity fractured under the weight of reality. For centuries, the crown had weathered wars, crises, and scandals, but rarely had its survival been threatened by the family's own implosion. This was not an external attack, it was a battle from within, and the world watched as the institution trembled on its foundations. And just when it seemed the storm had peaked, another revelation threatened to bring the entire house down. The world thought it had heard everything. But buried deep within Camilla's midnight words was a single phrase, overlooked at first, that pointed to a far darker scheme. When uncovered, it revealed that this wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a calculated plan with consequences that could shake the throne itself. Suddenly, the scandal transformed into a terrifying question of survival. What had seemed like a crisis of image now looked like a threat to life itself. The phrase was subtle, almost lost in the tremor of her voice, but once replayed, it became impossible to ignore. Removing an heir. Those three words, spoken in passing, carried an undertone that froze blood. Analysts, journalists, and political figures began dissecting the implications, and the conclusion was chilling. This wasn't simply about influence, about silencing critics, or managing documents. It was about succession, about power, about clearing the path by eliminating those who stood in the way. The possibility alone was enough to send shockwaves through the palace and the world beyond. As commentators debated the meaning, speculation ran wild. Could George himself have been the target? The boy who had stumbled upon this secret, the very one who had recorded the evidence, was he the obstacle Camilla had feared? The question, once raised, spread like wildfire. Newspapers ran headlines that made even loyal subjects question whether a sinister plan had been unfolding within the palace walls. Suddenly, the scandal no longer belonged to gossip columns, it had crossed into the realm of conspiracy, treachery, and unimaginable betrayal. Inside the palace, fear spread swiftly. Security around the children was tightened overnight. Corridors once open to family and staff alike became sealed with guards, their presence a stark reminder that innocence had been replaced by suspicion. Catherine, who had already been shaken by the exposure of her son's involvement, now saw the danger in full light. The look in her eyes was no longer only that of a protective mother, It was the gaze of someone who realized the threat wasn't abstract, but real, immediate, and directed toward her child. The thought was unbearable. To Catherine, the phrase "removing an heir" was not political. It was personal. It meant George's safety had been compromised, his life entangled in the darkest of palace intrigues. Her resolve hardened. She would not allow her son to become a casualty of ambition, nor let history repeat the horrors that had once consumed Diana. Every instinct in her screamed that they were no longer dealing with scandal, but survival. For William, the revelation was equally devastating. The phrase dragged him into a battlefield he had spent his life trying to avoid. He had long known the monarchy was fragile, but now he saw it teetering on the edge of collapse, undone not by external enemies, but by betrayal within. His fury was no longer about Camilla's voice in the dark, it was about the possibility that her words carried intentions that threatened his very bloodline. To him, this was not a misunderstanding, it was war. The monarchy itself began to falter beneath the weight of this new interpretation. Confidence in its future evaporated, as the public speculated not just about scandal, but about survival. The crown, already cracked by division, now appeared to be built on shifting sand. Every whisper, every headline, every debate deepened the sense that the institution was unraveling in real time. What had once been its greatest strength, its image of stability, was shattered, replaced by suspicion, fear, and looming collapse. But before the world could process the horror, Camilla herself made one final, shocking move. Cornered, exposed, and out of time, Camilla faced her reckoning. In one last public address, she tried to twist the narrative, casting herself as victim, as survivor of palace conspiracies. But the world had already heard the recording. Her words only deepened the wound, leaving the monarchy fractured, the people divided, and the shadow of George's midnight recording etched forever in history. This was not simply a speech, it was her final gamble, an attempt to salvage what little power she could still claim. Camilla's final desperate plea rang hollow. She spoke of betrayal, of enemies within the palace walls conspiring to bring her down, of narratives twisted to fit a cruel agenda. She tried to present herself as a woman under siege, a victim rather than the architect of her own downfall. But the world wasn't listening with sympathy, it was listening with suspicion. The recording, played and replayed across every media outlet, had already judged her. No matter how polished her words, the weight of truth crushed her attempts at redemption. The public's reaction was swift and merciless. Crowds who once cheered her appearances now turned their backs. Commentators declared her credibility in ruins, her influence shattered. Even those who had once defended her struggled to find excuses. The people no longer saw her as a queen consort. They saw her as the embodiment of secrecy and manipulation, a figure whose midnight words had exposed the fragility of the crown itself. For Camilla, it was the collapse of everything she had fought to build. And then, there was Charles. He stood by her side physically, but in spirit, he seemed miles away. His silence cut deeper than any condemnation. His eyes revealed heartbreak, not only for the chaos that had engulfed his reign, but for the impossible choice he had been forced to make between wife and family. He uttered no defense, no absolution. His silence was an admission of defeat, a quiet acknowledgement that the institution he had inherited was bleeding, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. William and Catherine, though they never celebrated openly, shared a quiet triumph. They had protected their son, shielded him from the direct fury of Camilla's retaliation, and ensured that his recording became the light that pierced through the shadows. Yet, triumph did not come without fear. They knew that what George had set into motion could not be undone. They feared what the monarchy would look like in the years to come, and whether the weight of history would crush their children as it had crushed generations before them. George himself remained unaware of the magnitude of what he had done. To him, it was a recording, an instinctive act of curiosity. But to the world, it was the moment that forever altered the monarchy's course. His innocent decision had revealed truths that no one dared confront, and in doing so, had reshaped the crown's destiny. History would remember him not only as heir, but as the child whose hand exposed the palace's deepest fracture. And so the world was left stunned, caught between shock and anticipation, waiting for the next revelation. The monarchy had survived scandals before, but never one like this, born not of rumor, but of undeniable truth, captured in the unsteady hands of a child. The crown remained, but it was cracked, fragile, its future uncertain. The call had ended, yet its echoes continued to haunt every corridor, every chamber, every whisper of royal power. The call may have ended, but its echoes still haunt the corridors of power, shaping the monarchy's fate for generations to come. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.